Hello, and welcome to episode 41 of TBR, the To Be Read podcast, where we talk about the books we love and the topics that interest us. I'm Patrick Stemp, and with me, as always, are Michael Ronn and Jamie Maltman. How you guys doing?
Great. How's it going, Patrick?
Good. And tonight we have guest author Maya Goode joining us. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks for coming on. Tonight we're going to be talking about reading literary fiction and learning to love it. And before we go into our roundtable of what we've been reading over the past week, we usually like to give our guests a minute to talk about just kind of more general, the kinds of things that you like to read, or and even what you've been reading recently, if you like.
Well, primarily I would say that I'm a pretty eclectic reader. I grew up reading a lot of literary fiction, plays, poetry, and then I went for 10 years not really reading anything that wasn't assigned in school. So for 10 years I pretty much read psychology studies. And I came out of there needing to relearn how to love reading. And so right now I currently read, I'm reading a lot of short stories. Literary short stories. I'm also listening to a lot of literary audiobooks, and I'm getting back into some physical classics that I've been reading on my Kindle.
Okay, cool. So we'll do our roundtable of what we've been reading over the past week, and I usually go left to right on the bottom of my screen, which means we're going to start with Michael this week.
Okay, I'm first up. It's kind of rare. All right, yeah. Well, I got a book recommendation at the end, or at last week after we finished our episode last week from a good listener of the show, good friend of the show, John L. Monk. And it was a book called Why We Get Fat by Gary Taub. And it's interesting because I mentioned that, you guys know how I love food, food books. Anything that has to do with food, I'm probably going to read it. And this was interesting because he talks about how the reason we get fat isn't necessarily cholesterol or even salt. It's sugar, and more importantly, it's carbohydrates. And I won't go too much into the body functions because he gets really deep into how the body works and all that, and that was kind of interesting from like a physiological standpoint for me. But yeah, it was interesting, and he recommended it to me because he told me that it's worked out. I believe for his wife quite well. That book definitely changed his life and their life. So definitely a low-carb diet is something that's interesting and would be interesting to try. So that's the first book that I read. And then I also read and finished The Tipping Point by Malcolm Gladwell.
Okay. Fantastic
book. Definitely a Malcolm Gladwell book, though. He kind of goes around and around.
Yeah.
But it was good, and it was actually a little shorter than Outliers, from what I remember. It seemed like Outliers went on forever, but this one was a bit shorter, and I enjoyed that a lot. Really not much to say about it other than if you haven't read it, you probably should, because Gladwell's the man. And I also read some poetry this week. I read some poetry by Molly Peacock. I don't know if you've heard of her, Maya, but I think she's won a bunch of awards and things like that.
I think I haven't heard of her.
I don't know. Have you heard of her, Patrick?
No.
Okay, well, I rest my case then. Okay. Yeah. So
which of her collections, or?
The Second Blush was the collection of poems that I read, and it was okay. It didn't blow me away, but
Notated.
Yeah, it was okay. I mean, she's got good technique, but the imagery didn't blow me away. So, yeah. So next month is Poetry Month, so I'm wanting to read some poetry to get ready for that. So that's kind of my week. I read a few more books, but that's all I'll talk about tonight.
Okay. And next on my screen is Maya.
Just within the last week, I just finished The Laughing Man, which was a short story by J.D. Salinger. The previous short story was The Hasselblad, which was by a new author, Jocelyn Johnson, and I found her writing very interesting, and she's working on her first novel, so I'm really looking forward to her getting that sold so I can read it. As far as audiobooks, I'm currently listening to Che Guevara. It's the really massive autobiography. It's not autobiography, massive biography by John Lee Anderson. I started the physical book like years ago, never finished it, so I'm listening to it on audiobook. And then
is it narrated by anyone interesting, or?
I don't pay attention to the narrator. You either are a narrator that keeps me awake or one that keeps me asleep. I don't really track the names. But I'm also reading a couple books on Kindle. I'm reading Middlesex, which I just started the other day, and I'm about a third of the way through War and Peace.
Cool.
Which I love.
And Middlesex is by who?
1 second.
Jeffrey Eugenides, I think it is.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a horrible to pronounce Greek name that every time I try to pronounce it, I butcher it.
Yeah, I don't even know if I said it correctly.
I am so bad at butchering names.
Yeah, that name will break your jaw. If you say
Yeah, Eugenides, Eugenides, Pulitzer Prize winning.
Eugenides.
Very good book.
Okay. And that puts us to Jamie.
Cool. Well, I finished I started the Golem and the Ginny a couple of weeks ago. I finished that last night, and wow, that's one that Amy Schubert had mentioned on the show back when she was on with us, and it was on the Goodreads Fantasy Picks last year. So it was the debut author by Helene Wecker, and it's basically set in 1900 New York, and it's the story of a golem, so like Kabbalah Jewish folklore created like clay creature that's a servant, and a genie from like a genie kind of thing from Syria, and that both end up in 1900 New York, not really knowing anything about anything, and so it's kind of like there's almost like the alien story of them exploring and getting to know and adjusting to life there and getting to know people, but at the same time it's all these intertwining stories because they'll have like the little bit of the story of the guy who was the master that commissioned the golem being made, and then the guy who made the golem, and then the guy or the rabbi that she meets there, and then his nephew, and then this person, and then this doctor, and so there's all these different. So at the beginning, it starts out. It's not like a page turner sort of a paced book anyway. It's got like a really nice flow to it. But if you read a lot of other kinds of fantasy, like I do, and like the people in the Goodreads book club do, there's some people saying, "Oh, it took me a little while to get into it." So it's for some people it was put downable in that first 50 pages, maybe 100 pages, but there was one of the plot turns that happened at around 100 pages got me more engaged. So I was like, okay, now I really do want to keep reading it instead of just sort of getting to it when I get to it. And then by about the 200-page mark, I was really hooked and loved it. And by the end, I was fantastic. Like I really, really enjoyed the ending. So really, really cool book. I would highly recommend it and enjoyed it a lot. And they do an amazing job of sort of the Jewish community, like the Jewish immigrant community in New York in 1900, and then the Little Syria in New York in 1900, but then other neighborhoods that they go through in Manhattan. It's really, really cool. So I read that. With my son, I read Bone Tall Tales. So the other one and we definitely like that, by Jeff Smith. We like that a lot better than Rose. Like Rose was decent. We thought this one was pretty good, and like parts of it were really good. And it gave me more chances to use the rat creature voices and stuff like that when I tell it to my son. So yeah, he liked it a lot. He actually liked it so much that my wife read it to him first, and then turned around, and then I read it to him like over the course of the next few days after that again. So
that's cute.
Yeah, and then I read. It was a book that I think I saw in like a daily Kindle email or something like that. But it was Show or Tell: A Powerful Lesson on a Critical Writing Skill. It's like a 30-page book by James Thayer. But I read some of the examples, and it was like a $2 book or $1.50 book or something like that, and it was a really good approach to that, because I know people are always saying show don't tell, but he gives, first of all, he talks a bit about the why, then he gives examples of this would be telling, and then here's a showing version. Then he flips it around and says, here's a passage from a famous book that's showing, and here's the really lame telling version of that. And then he goes through sort of topic-wise, saying like, so character descriptions, here's some examples of like, this is the idea you want to get across, this would be a telling, this would be a showing. Or setting descriptions, or this, or that. And he had a whole bunch of different things like that. And then exercises at the end. So just really efficiently done, no padding, like it's all about that. And I thought it was really good for that particular topic. So if you're ever, for writers at that point where they want to revisit that area a little bit, I would recommend that one. And then the other one I read was Libby Hawker was on the Self-Publishing Podcast, last week or a couple of weeks ago, and her book, Gotta Read It, 5 Simple Steps to a Fiction Pitch That Sells. Yeah, no, well, that was like $1.
Yeah, I read that one too.
Instantly.
Yeah, and it's because like you heard Sean and Johnny, you know, they were on with us a couple of weeks ago, saying as good as they are at copywriting this stuff and as many books as they've written, that's like one of the toughest parts is coming up with good product description for Amazon and everywhere else. So I liked her approach, and I thought she did a really good job with that. And so I've already I don't know, because I'd read so many blog posts, and I'd researched it, and I'd looked at other people's, and I'd done so many things, and I'd asked for advice and got feedback, and I think her approach to it was really good, and made it clear and just sort of crystallized a few things that weren't there so far for me. So like that, and I've got a couple of those that are processed this week for upcoming projects. So yeah, that was my week in reading.
Okay, good. So I'm going to mention, before I get into my list of what I did read, I'm going to just talk for 2 seconds on what I'm going to read. I'm going to go back and go through a read-through of Good Omens. I figured it was about time with the sad news this week that Terry Pratchett passed away.
Yeah.
So that was obviously hit the writing community hard. And, I haven't read very many of the Discworld books. It's something I've always wanted. It's like I've read the first couple, and then got off to other things. And one of the other, I think it's a side book in that world, which is should be a good one for your kids, is The Amazing Maurice and his, what's it called? The Amazing Maurice and His Educated Rodents. Sort of a strange little side story in that world, and it's a great book. But I've got an old ratty old paperback copy of Good Omens. It's been read a bunch of times, and I actually downloaded the digital version so I can read it on Kindle. So that's what's going to come. And what I did read this week, I started with Choose Yourself Guide to Wealth by James Altucher, which I think may have just come out today. I got like a hardcover copy from him. And if you've read Altucher before, I would definitely suggest reading this one. You know what you're in for. He tells a lot of the same stories that you've probably heard before, but he also goes into a lot of things that maybe he hasn't talked about so much on his blog. The financial stuff. How do you value a company, and how does he pick a stock and stuff like that? And even if you're not into that stuff, it's very interesting. As you know, he's an interesting guy with a strange take on some things, and it's a really enjoyable read. And then I finished reading Techniques of the Selling Writer by Dwight D. Swain. So that was a book that Sean Platt had recommended a couple weeks ago. And have any of you read that?
I just bought it a couple of days ago.
It is, it's awesome. I think I said this last week. I don't think I found it quite as dry as Sean did. It's very literary. It was written in 1965, I believe, and all of the advice is the same stuff you hear today. But he really breaks it down into just like component by component, characters, plot, description, just everything. And so it can get a little in the weeds, but it's really, really interesting book. And some of the stuff is a little dated. I think one of the things I noticed when he was talking about, lead characters, so when he breaks down the characters you have in a book, it was very clear that it seems that the lead is a man, the heroine is always a woman. If he did address that, it would have been in one sentence to say, and you get the other word. But it's of its time, and a lot of the references he makes, I didn't get some of the stuff that he was mentioning, but just excellent book, and I really think it's one that I'm going to be going back to over and over again. It's one of the few books on my Kindle that I just highlighted the heck out of it. I don't usually do that, and with this one I definitely did. And then I signed up for Kindle Unlimited, actually. So I grabbed, because now that we in Canada just got access to the, up till a couple months ago, I think all we got here, if we signed up for Kindle Unlimited, was the free shipping, right?
Yeah, we had the super lame version of Kindle Unlimited.
Yeah. Oh. Now we get books. We still don't have the Kindle TV.
Or sorry, that's Prime.
Amazon TV. Prime, sorry.
Yeah, our Prime membership is super lame.
Yeah. Prime is what I signed up for, yes, to get access to books that are in Kindle Unlimited. So I read Techniques of the Selling Writer and Bad Habits No More. Bad Habits No More and Writing Habit Mastery by Steve Scott. And I actually more skimmed them than read them. They're pretty short, and I was, Steve Scott, somebody who's kind of been making the rounds of all the podcasts, and you hear his name every day right now. And wanted to check out some of his stuff and see what it was all about. And they're interesting books. I just kind of skimmed through them, looking at the headings to see if there was any information in there that I didn't already know from other sources that I've read. And there wasn't a heck of a lot, so I think they're good if they're the kinds of books that it's a good starting point if you're looking to build better habits and do things like that, and you haven't already read, a dozen other books on the topic.
Yeah, I've read Writing Habit Mastery. I enjoyed that one quite a bit, but I think Steve Scott, I think he's best when he's talking about internet marketing. Mm-hmm. So like digital marketing blueprint, suitcase entrepreneur, habit stacking. I think he's more in his element there than he is with the actual writing, especially for us fiction writers,
Right. Yep, sure. And that's my week in reading. So we can move on to our topic. And we're going to talk about reading literary fiction and learning to love it. Oh, Maya's rubbing her hand again. Go ahead.
Be still, my heart. Be still. I love literary fiction. I just cannot tell you how much I love literary fiction. It's to the point where I've been reading it in a different way since finishing school, and while I always love literary fiction, I like it even more now. And there are so many misconceptions about it that I'm just like ready to slay them all. Because literary fiction is exciting and it's fun and it's not dry and boring and like you're sitting in a high school English class. At least not in my opinion. It shouldn't be, Like I said, I'm reading War and Peace, and everyone sees that book and thinks, oh, the huge tome, it's horrible. And they don't see, me cracking up at page 200 because there's 18th century frat boys jumping out a window because they're drunk and like playing games on a ledge. Like there's just so much stuff that stays the same in literary fiction that you can relate to that I feel like people totally miss out on.
It's funny, Tolstoy stuff is stuff that I would at some point attempt. Like, within the world of literary fiction. Like, I've got a buddy of mine that actually went on a Tolstoy binge back in like late high school and did read War and Peace and read some of his other stuff too, and was like, yeah, no, it's really cool. And I think the fact that you've got this interesting historical period that it's set in, like that it almost like treating it almost like historical fiction with a whole bunch of characters and all this stuff going on, that that has appealed to me, as opposed to some other areas, So that's like sort of the really long kind of. That's one
there's
area,
great
right?
modern literary fiction too. I just finished The Brief and Wonderful Life of Oscar Wilde, and that was a book that was, I felt ambivalent about it in some respects, but it brought up all these interesting questions and it made me think about the world around me and other cultures in a way that I didn't previously. And I feel like that's something that literary fiction gives me that I don't necessarily get when I'm reading something that I'm just reading it for fun, or something that's just strictly genre-based and it doesn't touch on the deep questions as much. Like some of the books that I enjoy the most aren't necessarily books I have fun reading, or books that make me think, or they're books that make me mad. It's like I have this relationship with the book rather than I'm reading the book and consuming the media is kind of the difference I'm feeling.
So how would you differentiate between literary versus something that's just a classic? So, for example, is Don Quixote literary or is it a classic?
Well,
and the reason I bring it up is because I've been reading it for 2 years. So.
It's both. I think when people think of classics, they think of older books. You can have a modern classic, but you really don't know if it's a classic until 50 years later you find out if people are still reading it. Whereas literary fiction it's a touchy subject. We tried to define it for our podcast, and just getting a decent definition of literary fiction is a debate in and of itself. there are people that say literary fiction is just fiction doesn't fit any current genres. And then there are people that are like, literary fiction has to have all these highfalutin ideas and has to, deal with, the deepest human questions that keep it relevant over time. And then there are other people that say literary fiction is what 100 years later people decide was literary fiction. You don't always know it's literary at the time. And so if you look at literary fiction, there's a lot of stories that are literary fiction that are actually sci-fi, or they are genre, but they transcended the genre in some way. They asked the question in a different way, or they twisted the expectations of the genre in a way. And so just getting that kind of definition is difficult, and I think that's partially why I enjoy it so much, because I don't always know what I'm getting when I pick it up. Every single time I pick up something, I don't know what I'm expecting. Even if I read the wiki page in advance, I talk to people who have read the book, it's a different, I never really know, because there's no preset expectations of what it's supposed to be.
Yeah, I've always defined literary fiction as fiction that primarily focuses on the human condition. So, whereas I'm making some generalizations here, but
yeah, because a lot of genre does that.
Like sci-fi, fantasy, it focuses on story and character. Literary fiction focuses more on character, but it focuses on character in the sense of what it means to be human. So, I guess for me, I don't consider it a catch-all category. I've always gotten upset when people say that, it's just whatever's not sci-fi, fantasy, or romance, But I think that it's a little bit more than that. But I think it does have the ability to transcend. I actually read some short stories in Lightspeed magazine, and Christine Catherine Rush wrote some stories for it, and a lot of really famous authors that you would know, like Stephen King and George R. R. Martin, wrote stories in it, and I was reading it, and I've read a lot of short stories and literary short stories, so I know short stories, and it was interesting how I couldn't really tell the difference in terms of style of a literary story versus those stories, which were sci-fi and fantasy, and I felt like they asked a lot of big questions and focused really getting inside a character's head, which I think sci-fi and fantasy authors don't always do as well.
Yeah. I think my definition of literary fiction is definitely changing. It's changing the more I read it, especially since I've gone on this short story binge. I'm finding that the more I read literary fiction, the more I have to question what I actually think literary fiction is. There's an idea out there that any short story is literary fiction just by nature of the short story form. And I thought that was a little odd. But then I started reading, some short fiction that was genre, and there were definitely a lot of literary elements that I was like, maybe there's some merit to that.
I was actually gonna make a point to that because I don't know how much of what I've read you might that would be in the narrower definition of literary fiction, right? Probably some of the books, but not a lot. It's not something that I seek out necessarily, although if there was a good enough recommendation for a reason, I might try something. But on the short story side, I think I'm definitely more open to it because, and it actually it's funny, I was mentioning before we went on the show, the Writing Excuses podcast, but they were talking about the MICE quotient, the milieu, idea, character, event. A lot of literary short stories would be then in the I, right? Very, very much focused on the I, sort of question part thing, I think, or the character side. There's I guess you can go lots of different ways, but it is a lot of time an idea, that sort of question of something, but relating to the human condition, relating to the characters, sort of blending those two more than the event, more than the plot specific thing, or more than wow, this is a really cool setting. Although you'd have some where it is an exploration of that sort of thing. So I would say that I'm more willing and I'm more open to reading more on the literary side in short stories. Partially because it is less of a commitment, right? It's not some impenetrable 400-page monster, or what the big example when they're talking about the completion rates of books, the Goldfinch this past year, right? Where it's whatever it was, 54% of people actually finished it that bought it on Kobo or that sort of thing. So
yeah, I don't know. I guess I have a different opinion. I guess the older I get, the more stricter I get about the literary fiction that I read, just because I don't know. I think that literary fiction authors should be held to the same standard as commercial fiction authors. So, like the Mice quotient, I think literary fiction authors should have to follow that as well. I think that they should focus on story and plot, and a lot of the stuff that I've read, in college and getting out of college, nothing happens, or you have a 600-page book where just nothing happens. And there are authors that do that really well, and there are some authors that don't do it as well. And I think the ones who don't do it as well give the genre a bad name.
I also think the teachers give it a bad name because most literary fiction that I read does have a plot, does have a story. Things are definitely happening, but those aren't necessarily books that high school teachers are picking to teach to their kids. And so when you get somebody who's 12, 13, 14 years old, and you make them read something that's hella boring and it's set in a time period they don't understand and it uses language that is difficult, then it turns them off and they never get to explore anything else. And I think that is a huge problem. When I'm talking classic literary fiction, there's a lot of story that happened in classic literary fiction. There's also a lot of telling that happens in classic literary fiction. The writing style is very different. I'm talking modern literary fiction, again, I'm seeing a lot more story. I'm seeing a lot more just interesting thoughts coming out. There was a time period where everything was all like kind of hazy because all the authors were kind of messed up on whatever it was they were taking, and those happen to be the books that they're teaching in the schools. And so, of course, that's not going to be interesting to a high schooler, and it sets a bad tone for literary fiction going forward.
It's like any genre. I mean, every genre has its conventions. Like people rip on doorstop fantasy books, right? I mean, it's the same similar argument that, oh well, I don't want to read doorstop fantasy because it's too long, but that doesn't mean that the genre itself is that way. It just means as with any genre, romance, western, sci-fi, literary fiction, even poetry, you have to find the authors that resonate with you. And the only way you can do that is if you read widely, and if you read a lot. So for me,
and that's hard to get people to do if they're not used to reading literary fiction. Getting them to go over that hump is difficult, and that's where I've really looked at different techniques to get myself outside of my comfort zone to read different literary fiction, and it's opening my eyes in a way that it wouldn't necessarily if I was only reading the literary fiction that are on all the lists and that I think I should be reading. And sometimes it just takes changing your reading habits. If every time you read literary fiction it's only classics, maybe read short stories, maybe listen to something in an audiobook, just totally change how you normally read literary fiction to give yourself a new paradigm to see it through. I find that really is helping me a lot.
Yeah, I agree with what Jamie said, and that is starting with short stories. To me, I think the best literary fiction is short stories, like Flannery O'Connor and Bernard Malamud and John Cheever, like Steinbeck. Some of his stuff is kind of literary. Like I like good short stories, and I feel like if I like an author's short stories, I'm more willing to try their novels. Because, a 600-page novel is definitely a commitment, especially with literary fiction. But if you like their short stories, then it might be something worth trying. And same thing with poetry, too. I consider poetry is poetry, but I like to lump it in with literary fiction as well because it kind of has the same challenges when you're reading it,
But don't you think that the stereotype of literary fiction novels being 600 pages is just a stereotype? Like, a lot of literary novels are actually really short. There's a lot of 30, 40, 50, 60,000 word novels out there, and people just don't realize that they're literary novels. Joe Didion does not go on for 500 pages.
No, it's definitely a stereotype. It just like anything else, It's interesting because I think that people talk about literary fiction as if it's so different than everything else out there, but to me, it's just another genre. It's just another genre that's got its quirks, it's got its advantages, its disadvantages, it's got its good authors, it's got its crappy authors that everyone talks about that really aren't that good. Jonathan Franzen, but other things, just like anything else.
Wouldn't part of the problem be with that the other genres you might have there's more protectionism, right? Would be the nice way to put it, right? In terms of the literary genre, in terms of the gatekeepers and what qualifies and this is our thing. Like there's definitely groups like that are being the bastions and being the those gatekeepers of what is right and what is appropriate literary fiction. And a lot of people are put off by some aspect of that vibe that comes from some of their English teachers along the way, who are totally different, really, from like the actual ones that are publishing and criticizing modern literary fiction. But
I think literary fiction gets a bad rap for that, though, because I think all the genres have their gatekeepers. Try to write a romance story where at the end, one of the lead dies. Every romance writers, the agents, it's not going to happen.
Okay, I just mean there's but they're still not looking down their nose quite the same way as some of the people that are involved in the creation of literary fiction.
I don't necessarily think that's true. I think there are lots of romance writers that may look down their nose at some of the erotica writers. I think there are science fiction writers that may look down their nose at the romance writers. I think every genre has their gatekeepers and has their people that think, oh, well, we're the real whatever genre, and you guys, need to go do your own thing. I think that's common. I think the bigger problem is that because literary fiction is pretty much what's taught in academia, when those people start talking out their beeps, they have letters behind their name, and they can be really pompous about it, and people may actually listen a little bit and then point at them and say, you did this, whereas, when it's a science fiction writer doing it, everyone's like, well, it's just so-and-so.
Well, I mean, they're gatekeepers. I think that literary fiction does have that problem more so than other genres, but I think that the problem with literary fiction isn't that. It's just that you're right, Maya. They're stuck in academia, and academia is like 50 years behind everything else. Like,
exactly.
if I were to walk into a college today and talk about self-publishing, they would look at me like I'm a hydra, right?
Yeah.
But you step outside the university and talk to people about self-publishing. Oh, hey, that's awesome, man. So.
And the one thing you figure out the fastest, especially reading short stories, is that the problem with literary fiction is that the gatekeepers are stuck in academia, but literary fiction isn't. There's a lot of literary fiction that is not stuck in academia. Some of the freshest, most interesting literary fiction is literary fiction that is, coming from other countries, coming from other cultures. Maybe it's being published in small journals, small magazines, and I do think the self-publishing quote-unquote revolution just hasn't hit yet. I think it's rumbling beneath the surface. I think there are a lot of annoyed literary writers who are watching the genre writers and saying, hey, why not me? This isn't fair. Like, my agent doesn't want to give me any money, and no one's reading my book anyway, and why am I going to give away all my royalties for 100 with sales?
Right.
And I think eventually those writers are going to come over because the gatekeepers aren't treating the writers very well. And like I said, a lot of the freshest literary fiction is not what's coming out of those gatekeepers.
I think that what's going to start happening is literary fiction and poetry are going to hit at the same time. I've been saying that for a while. I think it's going to happen because I think they have so much in common, and I think that a lot of literary authors are they come from academia. A lot of them do, by and large, for the most part, and they still have a lot of bad techniques that have been taught to them by professors and things like that. And I think once they break free and start defeating a lot of those myths that Dean Wesley Smith starts talking about, like that writing is hard, that you have to struggle through it, that you have to rewrite a book to death. I think that the self-publishing it's going to hit, and you're going to start seeing a Hugh Howey of the literary world.
I totally agree, and even if people don't necessarily go that far, like I personally do think a book, like the kind of writing that I want to do, I want to rewrite it a gazillion times. I want sentence by sentence to be beautiful, but that doesn't mean that I can't self-publish. That doesn't mean that I can't think outside the box and do it in a fresh and new way. When you look at the history of writing, self-publishing was here long before regular publishing was. And some of the biggest and greatest writers of our time have been self-published writers. And I think literary writers just need to embrace that and learn their history and break away. And when that happens and the fresh stuff starts getting out, then some of the stereotype will start to fall. I really think a lot of the stereotype will start to fall.
And part of the problem with that, too, is that you've got between the starving artist aspect of literary fiction and the academic aspect, those two things are negatively impact the ability to adopt self-publishing, right? so it's people have another hurdle in a lot of cases to get over.
Yeah. Yeah, it really just boils
Starve
down
once,
to...
starve twice. You're just still starving.
Yeah. Honestly, I don't think artists need to starve, especially literary artists. I mean, I think that literary authors have just as much of a chance of making a living at writing literary fiction as genre authors do. The problem is just that a lot of literary fiction people haven't migrated to e-readers and e-books yet because the selection isn't there yet because everyone's behind. Everyone's behind and they're trying to protect print.
What I will say is, since coming back to literary fiction after school, originally, you know this, Michael, I was very anti-e-reader. I had a hard time reading ebooks. I have ADHD. The gray screen on the Kindle wasn't working, and I wasn't processing the language well. I was doing a lot of subvocalization on the original Kindles. And when I switched to the Voyage, the Kindle Voyage, it's a lot whiter. And I'm finding that my reading is just so seamless and so easy. And I'm finding it's actually easier to read literary fiction on my Kindle than it was on paper. And I never thought that I would say this. Yeah. And here's why. When I am reading something with complicated vocabulary, I don't have to put my book down and go get my, 25-pound OED that's sitting on the shelf. And the new, X-ray thing, it isn't across all books, but imagine you're reading War and Peace and you get to the 15th Kutuzov and you can't remember which Kutuzov it is, and you click it and you get the list of all the Kutuzovs that are in the book and which one it is. Can you imagine how wonderful that will be for more complicated literary novels? I think it makes my reading experience much faster and much more enjoyable because I'm processing it fast enough to fully get the feeling and the emotion behind the book rather than getting stuck at the words.
Yeah, and people read ebooks so much faster, and so you read books faster when you read ebooks. When you read on your e-reader, that's what I found anyway. It's like I would read books 2 times as fast, and I would actually buy more books as a result.
Amazon needs to bookmark this section of the podcast.
Yeah,
so that was a good pitch for literary fiction on the voyage.
Yeah, I wasn't
expecting. Go on a literary voyage.
Yeah, I am finding that ebooks, using Audible to listen to literary books, and going back and reading short stories are 3 of the biggest things that have helped me get used to reading literary fiction again.
I guess since you're a resident literary fiction expert, Maya, what are your favorite literary fiction books of all time?
My favorite of all time. My first one's going to be Anna Karenina, and that's just because it was the first one that really sucked me in. I read it for the first time in middle school. I picked it up. I read it in a day and a half. It just sucked me in. I probably for the first 10 years I would read it annually. Now I read it, once every 5-6 years. It's just a lovely story. I love the language. It's amazing. It is one of my favorites. I'm a huge Shakespeare fan. I love Shakespeare. So I have most of a library of Shakespeare that all says Cook Junior High on the top because I stole them from school. Some of the best audiobooks that I've read that were literary fiction, I would say The Way of All Flesh was hysterical. It is this old novel and it's satire, and I didn't realize it would be funny, and I was listening to it while I was doing data entry, and I just kept laughing at work. It is just an absolutely hysterical novel. It's beautiful.
Who's that by?
Let me look it up because I'm really bad with names. And I have all my Audible on my phone, and I have all of my books on my e-reader. Let me see here. But I am really bad with names. I'm so bad.
Sorry to break your flow there.
No. It's okay. It's okay. I am, like I said, I have ADD, and names is one of the things that just, I can't keep them in my head at all. At all. Let me see here. Where is it? I've got Madam
Samuel Butler.
Oh, The Well of Loneliness was really good on Audible as well. I definitely.
Would that be Samuel
Butler? The Way
Butler?
of Flesh was Samuel Butler. Yeah.
Butler. Okay.
And the guy who narrates it on Audible totally nails the tone of the book. And that's one thing. A lot of older classical literary fiction, if you're reading it, because the language is so different, you lose the tone and you can actually lose some of the enjoyment and the comprehension. Whereas if you're listening to it as an audiobook, if it's done well, the narrator can restore some of that tone, and you may actually understand it better than you would if you're reading the written word. Kind of how Shakespeare is a little easier to understand if you're watching the play versus reading the play. I find that Audible is great for some of the older literary classics that might be a little difficult to digest.
Awesome. Yeah, I like Anna Karenina as well. And I guess real quick, I guess my favorites would be Madame Bovary. Love Madame Bovary. It's one of my favorites. And then Beauty and Sadness by Yasunari Kawabata. That's a fantastic novel.
I got that because of you. I haven't read it yet. It's sitting on my.
Yeah, he's one of my favorite writers from Japan. He's really awesome. And then I'm gonna go against the grain. I love Moby Dick. A lot of people rip on it. They throw it out the window, but I love Moby Dick. It was fantastic.
I read it so long ago I don't remember.
Yeah.
You and Phone Bone can have long chats about it, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, we probably
Are any of you guys big Virginia Woolf fans? Well,
I'm not a Virginia Woolf fan.
I have a minor love affair with Orlando. And I actually watched it as a film when I was like 17 at some film festival. And I picked up the book. I don't know what I was expecting. I'd never read Virginia Woolf before. I was supposed to have, but I just wrote fake essays and got my A. And so I opened up this book, and the first 3 chapters, I was having such a hard time reading it. But then I started reading it out loud, and it was like reading jazz. Like the use of the language was like jazz. And to this day, it is one of my favorite literary novels for sure.
Cool. I'll have to check that one out. I read Mrs. Dalloway and just wanted to rip what little hair I had out of my head. Yeah. I'm not a fan of the stream of consciousness, but yeah. Well, Jamie, yeah.
I was just going to say it was too bad with Virginia Woolf. It was the name that was always there. I never explored it all. But my college within my university, Victoria College, had a significant Virginia Woolf collection at our library. So it's something that was always there as like a sign, but I never went down that particular stairwell.
Yeah, I love it. Absolutely love it.
Well, we're getting close to the hour, so we probably should wrap up. Maya, I guess you want to talk about your books and your work and where people can find you?
I was bristling when you called me an author because my books are not out. My books are.
Oh, come on, you're an author.
My books are. I have 2 rough drafts that are quickly becoming second drafts, and I'm working on a project under a pen name. But what my real focus on right now is on the Literary Roadhouse. It is a website and podcast, literaryroadhouse.com, and the whole point of the podcast is to explore literary fiction in easy, accessible ways. And so every week we pick a new short story, pretty much at random, and then the following week we talk about it. And so far the discussions have been really dynamic and really interesting, and it's changing the way that I view my relationship with literary fiction. It's changing what I see as literary fiction, and it's making me add a lot of books to my TBR.
You can plug your co-hosts too if you want.
Yeah.
My co-hosts are awesome. Let me just say my co-hosts are awesome. I have 3 co-hosts. I have Annie. She lives in Costa Rica. She's from Jersey. She's young. She's hip. She's really opinionated and feisty. I've got Gerald, who is our dad. We tease him a little bit, and he talks about how much more wise he is than all of us young whippersnappers. And he's great because he sees fiction in a really different way. He's read a lot more literary short stories than we have in large. And then our last co-host is Kanache. And he goes between London and Sweden, and so we're definitely a multi, country podcast. Gerald's in London, and again, he comes from a different background, immigrant background. He's a short story writer, and we always find something to disagree about, which is pretty much why when I looked at creating a podcast, I wanted a podcast where we would have dynamic discussions rather than a podcast with my friends where we all agree. And so I feel like we've achieved that. You know, when we sit down and talk about a short story, a lot of times we do literally tear it apart. And we have a lot of fun doing so. We're laughing, we're teasing, you know, it's a great experience.
Awesome. No, so happy you found that your gang to put that together and enjoy it that way. So.
And what's the website for Literary Roadhouse, Maya?
LiteraryRoadhouse.com.
Okay. Cool stuff.
Yeah.
Well, thanks again for joining us on the show tonight. It's always fun chatting with you, and it's great to have you on in our neck of the woods this time around.
It was great talking with you guys.
And so, I guess, did you want to finish off, or you want me to finish off?
Yeah, I'll finish it off. But just want to thank all of our wonderful listeners and watchers for tuning into this week's episode, and thank Maya for joining us. We broadcast Tuesdays at 9 o'clock Eastern, right? 9 o'clock Eastern. I got that wrong last time. And we haven't determined a topic for next week, but we will be joined by Stacy Claflin, fellow author, and we're going to have a great discussion, and we'll broadcast that topic closer to the date. And if you are listening, we would love, if you haven't already, to leave us a review on iTunes or Stitcher. We would greatly love that, and that helps us find more listeners and boosts our social proof. So with that, I guess we'll leave it at that, and we'll talk to you guys next week.
Happy reading, everybody.